Hi there. Before we get into the episode, I just wanted to give you a note. This is a classic episode from about a year and a half ago. The podcast has grown pretty significantly, and I think this is an important episode. So I'm putting it back out there for greater visibility. I think you'll enjoy it. If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. This is going to be one of a series of posts that are going to discuss attention compass in detail. And my goal here is to equip you with tools needed to implement your own attention compass. My reasoning, I think there's a lot of people out there that are struggling with the problems that attention compass solves. Information overwhelm, the associated stress, and the stress and fear that things are falling through the cracks. If you feel that way, I want to serve you as best I can. So I'm going to tell you how to implement your own attention compass implementation. And if you can do that, then my contention is that a lot of these problems will soften, will lessen in your life. So I'm going to give you the instruction set on how to do this. And just promise me that if you try and do it and struggle or try to do it and can't succeed, that you'll give me a call and let me help you get it fixed. So what we'll do today is we'll start with some assumptions that explain why attention compass is built the way it is and what problems it goes to solve. And this will help you make decisions about how you want to use your attention compass. And it should also help you figure out more about why you want to have an attention compass in the first place. It'll help detail these pain points that attention compass solves for people and has demonstrated that it solves for people. So with that intro, we'll take a quick look at a couple of underlying assumptions. And the purpose of these is to let you know where we have common ground, where you and I have common ground. And I think you'll agree that these assumptions make sense and thus that the logic of the tool is going to be useful to solve the problems that we want it to solve. So the first assumption is there are more than we could ever ... And what I mean by that, and trying to be clever, of course, is really twofold. One is there are more things to do than we could ever get done. And it's not hard to understand this, to look at your own life and look around the world at the number of things that you'd like to get done. And if you have a home and you have kids and you have a spouse and you have pets and all of these claims on your time, then you look around and there's so many more things to do. And we simply can think of more than we could ever get done. We can think of more things to do than we could ever get done. So that's the first part of there are more than we could ever. The second part of there are more than we could ever is there are more things to know than we could ever look at, try to consume, even understand whether or not we needed to know it. There's more information out there than could possibly be consumed by any individual. And you know the stats as well as I do. There's, X number 6 or 7 hours of whatever it is of YouTube video being created every minute. So not only is it beyond our capability now, but we're losing ground. And this is not a new thing, that there's more information out there than we could catalog, that we could assess, than really we could even be aware of. I think going back to the first libraries, however far back you want to go, the Library of Alexandria, somebody walked in there and said, "Wow, there's no way I could ever read all these scrolls." And they were right. And all of this sounds like it's just bad news. It's just, well, we're human and we're stuck with it. But beyond that, and I guess it kind of is, but beyond that, it makes us fear.
It makes us fear forgetting, losing, missing something, missing out on something. We want to do all these things, and we look at it and we recognize that we can't. So we have this background stress level of, well, it's not happening. So there are more than we could ever, and that's two parts. There are more things than we could ever get done, more things to do than we could ever get done, and there's more information to know than we could ever look at or catalog. The other underlying assumption is that we have that fear, since we have that fear, that there's this low level continual stress for us. And what that means is we know that there are things that we'd like to do, but keeping track of the things that we'd like to do. And we know that our memories are unreliable on this front. That's why we've built all the tools we've built, calendars and alarm clocks and kitchen timers. Our minds are simply not good at tracking the passage of time. And thus, time-sensitive tasks and to-dos tend to elude our brain, okay? And again, we create these artifacts and systems, but our brains don't trust them. And our brains don't trust these artifacts and systems for one very good reason. And that very good reason is not everything is in those artifacts and systems. And our brains have long experience in things popping up after their due date. And we become aware of them. Your brain recognizes that it has forgotten about it until it's too late to be useful. How many times have the brownies gotten burned? And each one of those things your brain recognizes. Another concern around this area is, as the human race and as our economy progresses into knowledge work, that's mental work. And when we try to keep things in our skull, when we try to remember mundane things, then there's this workbench idea that we're using up part of our productive asset. We need to be applying our brain space towards solving problems, towards making progress in the world, towards helping people, not towards trying to remember that the appointment is in 28 minutes or whatever that is. We need to build systems that help us remember these things so that we're not misusing that very valuable brain space that we should be applying to other kinds of problems. So all of this together, that the fact that we have these unreliable memories, all of that means that we need to get things off our mind, because if they're not on our minds, then we're not forgetting them and that stress goes down. So we got to get things out of our minds and put things into a system. And that system then will help us where our brain is weak. Thus, we can emphasize our brain's strengths and use it best where it's strong. And that's sort of this workbench idea. So those are really kind of two underlying assumptions that I think we can agree on. There are more than we could ever. There are more things to do than we could ever do, more things to know than we could ever look at. And that gives us some sense of missing out, some sense of sadness or fear. And that fear is a low level of continual stress for us because we know our brains aren't good at tracking this kind of information. So with those assumptions in place, we need to think about what are the implications of those assumptions. So if there's more than we could ever, if there's more than we could look at and more than we can get done, then that's a huge pile of stuff sitting out there. It's not dozens of things, it's hundreds of things, it's potentially thousands of things. And then you look into all the information that we've consumed over our lifetime, all the information that we've tried to become aware of, all the information that we've tried to remember or learn. All this is a lot more information that's going to fit in our brains. And that just means that we need ancillary systems. We need external systems to keep this stuff for us. I don't know that it's a terribly new need, but I think it's gotten more and more urgent as we've become knowledge workers and as we've become more dependent on our brains to help us do the work. So more information that'll fit into our brain. So we said that there are two kinds of more than we could ever. And one is more things to do than we could ever do. So that's tasks for us. And the other is more things that we need to be aware of, more information than we could ever. And that's just that information. And so if we're going to store things out there in the world, then we need to be able to store, say, both kinds of things, right? There's more than we could ever do, and there's more than we could ever read. But it's interesting because when you look at it, it's not really actually two different kinds of things. It's two different flavors, if you will, of information. A to-do, a task is just a piece of information that says, hey, I intend to do the thing, versus a piece of information about a multiplication table that says 6 times 6 is 36. They're not terribly different things. So the good news here is that we can put them all out into one kind of storage, so to speak. So there's one system where we can keep all this stuff and put it in one place where it's more easily dealt with. Now, it's a ton of stuff, which means it's a huge number of things, and it's actually double huge because it's a huge number of to-dos and it's a huge number of pieces of information. So all of that means that really our tactics are inadequate. Our tactics of trying to store all this stuff in our skulls are really inadequate to face the challenge. And that's kind of where this stress comes from, at least in my opinion, and in a lot of the stress literature, that fear is something that causes stress for us. So, such a huge number of things. Well, fortunately, we're to the point with our technology where we have systems. So if we can't store it in our brain and we need to store it, then we need to store it in a system. And there are really only a couple of choices. So one system is to offload it to other people, to other brains. Okay. Well, if it was 10% more than you needed to know, then that would be a reasonably practical approach, but it's not. It's 10 times, 100 times what you could store. So try to do it with other people and other brains is impractical, but they've got their own stuff to remember, right? So we're just left with some kind of system, some kind of information management system. And that's fine because the technology has caught up where we can store massive volumes of things. And it's not all that difficult to do it. So we need some kind of system because it needs to be external to our own brain. And really the only remaining choice is a system. And that's one of the implications of these assumptions that we've agreed on. We have another implication, and this is based on the more to do than we could ever get done. And it's a requirement that we get pretty good at task management. Now, there's more to say about this other than there's just more to do than we could get done. So one important fact about task management is that as human beings in our economy, we get paid on delivering artifacts, on delivering things to other people. Now, the variety of things is huge. It's physical products, it's documents, it's thoughts, it's songs, it's portrayals in terms of acting, it's sports, but we deliver things, artifacts to other people. And that's how all of us get paid. And creating those things, the act of creating those things, we call that work a task. We have all of these things that we need to deliver, and so we start talking about tasks, so we need a task management system. Now, most of us don't get paid to deliver bits of information. Most of us get paid to deliver more practical, more tangible artifacts. But in addition to storing information about our tasks, we also need to store other information. A lot of this information has to do with how are we going to get our tasks done? What other things are true about our situation that we need to take into account as we're doing our work. And so we need to continue to store this reference information. And when we look at this, again, this almost breaks down into two kinds of information, and we deal with that in one of our workflows, but really it's just information. And it's phrased in different ways for a to-do than it is for a piece of reference information. And we can drill down into detail on that later. The point is, tasks need to be first-class citizens in our information management system. So there needs to be some very good way for us to track this idea that something needs done and it's not being done now. Okay. And again, just looking back at it and saying, okay, well, a task is just a specific kind of information. So we can track it in an information management system with just a couple of additional tools. The point here is that we don't need a separate system for tasks versus reference information. I will say that this brings up the notion of managing time versus managing attention. So I will tell you that the attention compass is a task and attention management system versus a time management system. Well, what does that mean? Is that an important distinction? I think it is. I think when we try to manage time, we're trying to manage something that can't be managed. I think we're trying to manage something that happens to us rather than something that we have any real amount of control over. Time ebbs and flows and moves at its own pace, whether we like it or not. And we can't save it, we can't store it, we can't slow it down. And so trying to manage that is, I think, part of the problem. And if we manage our attention is something that can be expanded, that can grow, that we can utilize when we want to, and we can store and maintain better. Now, using attention does take time, so we've got to factor that in as well. So the system I'm describing is a tool for storing information in the right ways. And by the right ways, I mean as defined by the earlier analysis, that we have to store both to-dos and reference information. And when I say storing stuff in the right ways, I mean storing it such that it shows up when we need it to show up, storing it in ways that we can find it when we need it, storing it in ways that it almost delivers itself to us at the right time without us having to look for it. And so when we build the system properly, according to good rules for information management, then we find that these things begin to happen. Another implication about the tool from what we've looked at before, and this is an implication of the huge amount of stuff, really, but also the implication of another fact that we'll get to. The tool pretty much has to be electronic, because that's really the only way that two things can happen. One is it's the only way that such a huge volume of information can be stored and accessed with any reasonable speed. And the other is it's really the only way for our information, both task-oriented and reference information, to be available to us when and where we need it, which is pretty much anywhere. There was a time when you could have your file cabinet in your office at your office building downtown. For most of us, that time is gone, and we need to have our information with us more often and more readily available. So for those reasons, it's an electronic tool. And we talk in Attention Compass, we talk about specific ways to use paper, but that the tool itself and that the storage equipment itself needs to all be electronic so that it can store a huge volume of things and so that we can have it with us when we need it. So finally, I'll say, when we talk about task management, it's important not only to have a storage tool, but it's important to have workflows around that storage tool. It's important to have work habits and work processes that help us manage and maintain the information in the tool, but also that help us utilize the information in the tool in the best possible ways. There are 4 workflows in Attention Compass. So now that we've kind of laid this out, I'll tell you about these 4 workflows in a minute, but let me tell you a little bit about where we're going from here. So we'll talk about some of the properties of this system and how the system needs to work. And we'll try to define some ways for you to set this system up for yourself and some ways that it needs to be working. And then we'll talk about the workflows in some little bit of detail. We won't have time to get into them completely here, but that'll be part of the continuing series of stuff. So where we are is we've talked about Attention Compass and what its purpose is. Its purpose is calm clarity around executing our stuff. Underlying assumptions, there's more than we could ever, and that causes us a continuous underlying level of stress, which means we need to get things off of our mind. Well, it works out because our mind is a terrible place to keep this stuff anyway. So the implications are there's a ton of stuff. There's a ton of tasks and things, reference information for you to be aware of. That means we have to store it in a system. And since part of it has to do with to-dos and has to do with things that we want to accomplish in the world, then tasks have to be a first-class citizen and not some weird thing that we tack on the corners of the system. So now we get out into the properties of this system, and I mentioned this a minute ago. So an electronic system is the best. Okay, well, why is that? Why can't we use paper? Well, I'm going to call electronic storage intangible, and that's probably not perfect, but electronic storage doesn't quite have the same kind of physical reality that other forms of storage have. Okay. And at the end of the day, we're talking about 2 kinds of storage, right? We're talking about electronic storage versus some media-based storage, which is probably paper. And if you try to write down all the things that you might be responsible for, if you use a piece of paper to try and write down all the things that you might want to do, if you use a piece of paper to write down all of the information that you need to be aware of or that you need to become aware of, then you're going to find very quickly that it's an unmanageable amount of information. And so we tend to think of like the intangibility of it, of electronic information. And it's really fascinating to see that. And so oddly enough, in the modern economy, we've gotten so used to electronic systems. And oddly, the management of our tasks and the management of our attention and time seems to kind of be the one place where people get hung up on analog. They get hung up on paper. And I guess maybe because we think in terms of books, or that's what our habit is, or whatever it is, we think in terms of permanency. Maybe the journaling crowd has something to do with how this is working. But it's really, to me, it's interesting and odd that people really get hung up on this and they go, no, I want to record my tasks on paper. Well, you don't record your music on paper. You don't record your videos on paper. So it's intangible. It's not quite a physical reality. It's so much lighter. It's so much cheaper to store it electronically than it is on paper. It's much more portable. So you can literally store everything that you need to store on your phone, and it's there in your pocket with you all the time. It's there in your purse with you all the time. And so Built properly, a system gives you access to your information, which is both your reference information and your tasks, all the time. And it's there for you wherever you need it, whenever you need it. So it's more portable. For electronic systems, updates are easier. So it's easier for the technology. We've gotten very good at updating our technology, our electronic technology, versus updating other kinds of information storage. So it maintains itself to some greater or lesser degrees. Not that the process is totally seamless, but that with reasonable maintenance, you can take care of it and keep it current much more easily. With electronic information, it distributes even automatically to many more places. So it's much easier in an electronic system to have multiple copies of things than it is in any sort of physical system, any sort of paper-based system. And it's actually useful to have that distribution in multiple places, but you've got to manage it properly in order for it to be a benefit and not a problem. As we all know, electronic information is much more searchable than is physically recorded information. As we all know, electronic information is much more searchable than any information that's recorded physically. If you have a journal book, the only way you can search it is sequentially, flip the pages, versus information that's recorded electronically. And our search is getting better all the time. But again, just another reason that the system pretty much has to be electronic, as it's more searchable. And then finally, we'll say that the electronic system will recognize has more ways that we could organize it. And what I mean by that is if there's a physical store, it can only be stored in one way. You can't reshuffle it easily. So a library, the books are ordered in the Library of Congress cataloging system. If you wanted to switch the books around and do it in reverse, it would be a Herculean task to reverse search, to reverse order the books, because you'd actually have to move the physical books. Versus in an information system, then reordering and having those indexes moved around is a relatively trivial problem. Well, it's trivial now because we solved it out in the electronic world. So the primary property of the system is that it pretty much has to be electronic, which is not that big a hill to climb in our modern era. Another property of the system that's implied by all these things, and this really is because of the amount of stuff. One of the properties of the system is we need to use a backlog metaphor to store it. So what's a backlog metaphor? A backlog metaphor is the record is permanent, but we use search and indexes to make different parts of it more visible to us at different times. And this has a lot to do with the recency and the amount of the information that we're trying to deal with. So when it comes to our personal information and to our task and information list, we've tried other storage metaphors. We've tried cataloging it. In other words, we've tried to put it down in these journals and make it sequential. We've tried to, for our task information, we've tried to store it in the long term in a schedule, right? But those places didn't work. And so if we're thinking about information, and we're thinking particularly about information that we don't need now, either task-oriented information or reference information that we don't need now, we need to park it. But just like your car, there's good and bad places to park information. You want to park it where you can retrieve it easily. You want to park it where it'll be safe. You don't want to simply park it where it's out of your sight and out of the way. So a little bit more about what a backlog is. So a backlog is a large store of information And the difference between a backlog of information and a pile of information is in how you work with it to turn it into a backlog. You can think of a backlog as a maintained, a gardened, if you will, set of information versus some random set of information where information is just stored in there in wild ways. So the reason that it becomes a backlog is because we work with it consistently. And when we look at that, that's where these workflows are. And the workflows are intended to turn the pile of information into a backlog and keep the backlog from turning back into a pile. Because a pile is hard to search and a pile is hard to deal with versus a backlog that's pretty easy to deal with. So when we're looking at tasks and information about things that we're not doing right now, then the backlog makes even more sense because we're able to adjust things and resort things and reorient things to face current reality as compared to it being stored statically in ways that are very difficult to change. And so when we look at ways that we've managed tasks previously, one of the only other ways that we've managed tasks is to try to identify them in minute detail and then to schedule them precisely in a calendar so that we could, in theory, say, hey, 6 months from now at 2:43 p.m., what is your plan? According to your plan, what will you be doing at that time? And that this system would give you an answer. Well, one of the things we've learned is that's just entirely too inflexible, that nobody has that level of control over their lives. And so we need to move away from that hard schedule, those minute definitions of tasks, and move into a more fluid situation. And that's where this backlog idea comes back into play, is instead of trying to chisel something in stone and live by it for the next 6 months, that we're instead putting the work in to maintain it and keep it fresh and evergreen, to work with our data and our information and our task list in ways that help us understand it better all the time. And that's a lot of what these workflows are about, is to help us work with our information store in meaningful ways. And again, one of the big things that we have to be able to do is, because of the nature of tasks in our lives, and by the nature of tasks, I'll reiterate, there's more to do than we could possibly get done. And there's certainly more to be done than we can do now. Well, what that means is that we're aware of tasks that we can't do, and thus we need to postpone those tasks. And that's just the simple act of what we're actually doing. If there are 10 things to do and you pick one of them, then you literally have postponed the other 9. You're not doing them now. And so if we can track those decisions, I think one of the major sources of fear is that we fear that we're going to forget that we postponed something. And then we're going to forget to do it at all. And it's never going to get done. It's not so much whether or not it's done by some deadline, but whether or not it's done at all. And so managing those things is tracking that postponement decision, right? So, and again, just an example to make this absolutely clear. My grass needs to be cut right now. Your grass may need to be cut right now. And we're not cutting our grass right now. Well, you may be. But we've postponed that. And we've decided not now. And so tracking that and making sure that we're aware of that not now decision. Okay. And this is pretty clear when we say, when I say, hey, I'm not doing the dishes, that is not a statement of absolute fact for all future time. It means I'm not doing the dishes now. Right? Now, sometimes it means I'm not ever doing the dishes, right? But usually it means, nope, I'm not doing it now. We say we're not doing something. It's usually an indication of a postponement decision. And as we postpone things and as we push things off into the future for perfectly rational reasons, okay, for good reasons, then we need to be able to track those things so that we don't have to carry around the fear and the stress of potentially forgetting those things. So let's reiterate again kind of where we've gotten to date. So we started with a couple of kind of common assumptions, and then we looked at some implications of those assumptions. And those implications have turned into properties of a system. And those properties are the system almost has to be electronic. There's no other reasonable choice for the system. So how then do we use paper? And we'll get into that. Electronic is best just because of the properties of electronic information. It's more searchable, it's more storable, it takes up less space, it's lighter weight, all these different kinds of things. It's more distributable. So electronic is where we need to be at. And because of the amount of stuff, and because stuff in there, some stuff in there will age in a bad way. Okay. Tasks age like fruit ages, not like wine ages, right? And so we need to utilize what's referred to as a backlog metaphor to store it. And we talked about the fact that a backlog is just a list that we interact with in certain defined ways in order to keep it as a backlog rather than letting it devolve back into a pile. We have to make and track postponement decisions. We have to make sure that when we postpone, we're not simply trying to forget. That since we have to postpone, and this is something that's challenging to our brains, then we need to have good ways to make and track those postponement decisions. And so we think about electronic system with a backlog and tracking postponement. We think about reminders, and we think about ways for information, in particular task-oriented information, to show back up at us when we need to see it, rather than having to go hunt for it or just even worse, losing it. So when we look at these three properties of the system, this means, and I'm going to use some terminology here, and I'm going to define some terminology. What we've defined here is a personal information management system. And that's pretty easy to see that that's what we've done. So the information that we need to manage is the information about the things that we want to do, and information about the information itself, information we need to be aware of at some point. And so we're beginning to define a system that helps us do a good job of managing our personal information. And as you would have guessed, that's exactly what Attention Compass is designed to do and to be. It's first and foremost a personal information management system. What does that mean? Well, one thing it means is you don't have to have anybody else's permission to implement it. The tools are readily available, not expensive. The workflows, I'll teach you how to do that, but you don't need your boss's permission. You don't need your spouse's permission to begin to manage your personal information. It's your personal information. And so that means that you have the word is agency. You have agency here, and you can make the decision of whether to invest the time and effort and energy to become good at this, or whether to continue to waste the time and energy of being worried about whether or not you're managing this stuff well. But this is why I want people to have the attention compass. This is why I want you to have the attention compass, is so that you can gather the benefit and gather the pain relief, if you will, of having your personal information well managed. It's not, I think, that information is unmanageable. I think it's just that we're not trained and we're not coached in how best to manage our personal information stores. And for years and years, it didn't matter because we worked so much with our hands, and so much of the information that we needed really was just present in the world around us and visible to us all the time, that we didn't need to go to any particular link to create a personal information management system. Now, I think we do. I offer Attention Compass to you as that personal information management system. And what we've done thus far is we've kind of defined the properties that such a personal information management system will need to have, particularly with respect to the system as the tool. Now, at this point, we're going to get into the workflows. So we've defined what a tool looks like, and we can go into more detail in future episodes about the specifics of which tool and what the settings are and some of these different kinds of things. And I can show you how to do that. But now you understand a lot about what this tool needs to look like. So let's talk about the workflows. And the workflows will help inform the tool use a little bit for you. And I'm just going to have to skip over these real quick, and in future episodes, we'll drill down. Because as I said before, the data store is only as good as the workflows and the consistency with which the data is maintained. Because particularly task information, as I said a minute ago, ages more like fruit than it does like wine. And it's fine for it to sit there, but it can get to its past due date pretty quickly. And so these workflows are all about managing and maintaining our information store such that it maintains its vitality and usefulness for us over the long term, rather than becoming some static, dusty record of something that we thought we were doing 18 months ago. So again, there are 4 workflows, and they're all about helping the tool be a backlog management system. Because the tool can be designed, but you have to use the tool in certain ways in order for it to be a good backlog management system. So we'll cover the 4 workflows, and we'll do it in order of the most frequent workflows to the least frequent workflows. So the first workflow is capture. And capture is all about taking the stuff that we observe in the world, taking the information that our brain perceives, taking the tasks that our brains generate for us, and putting that into the system. I say it's the most frequent, and we'll talk about what I mean by that. But when we capture, we really want to be observant in 2 primary areas. So one, of course, is the external world. When we're capturing, we want to be aware of the world outside of us, because that's how new information typically gets presented to us. It's from the world outside, from things we hear, from things we see, from things we read, conversations that we have. New information shows up. Well, it's interesting because that's also how new tasks show up typically. Okay, is we're looking at the external world. And as we're observing the external world, capture is us recording important things about the external world. Important is important to you. It may or may not be important to me, and that doesn't matter. And this is a distinction that we get into later. But we're observing the external world, but we're also observing the internal world. When we think about capture, if we have an idea about something, hey, a new way to try to solve a problem, we want to capture that and not let it simply percolate in our brains for too long. As soon as we have the idea, we want to externalize it so that we can figure out what to actually do with it, rather than just leaving it sit in our brains to be forgotten, lost, or trampled by other information. So when I say capture is the most frequent, capture is really, I'm going to say, semi-continuous. We're always available to capture. If we're doing a piece of work and we're focused on a piece of work and something happens in our internal world, we need to capture that. If hopefully, as we're doing our work, we've done a good job of blocking out the external world, which is actually pretty easy. And so the external world is not presenting things to us, but we still need to be available to capture from the internal world. So we're capturing semi-continuously, and we're throwing things into our data storage tool. And it turns out that it's a lot of stuff, and it turns out that it changes pretty frequently and gets updated pretty frequently, which means that we need to make sure that we're managing the new things as they come on board. So our second workflow, and the second more frequent, is a workflow called processing. So processing is dealing with the stuff that we've captured. And it's making sure that we're gardening our information store on a consistent basis. When I say consistent, I'm talking about 5 plus or minus 2 times per day that we go in and process. It's typically after we have done some capture, after we've done some work, after there are some things that we've captured, then we go in and we process them. And processing has 2 steps. So the first step of processing is to take the captured item and turn it into what it is. And that may mean it becomes an appointment. It may mean it becomes a different kind of to do. It may mean it becomes reference information and gets put away somewhere, but we refine it a little bit. We turn it into what it is, because before we do that, we can't do the second step. And the second step is to put it where it belongs. So in order to put it where it belongs, we have to understand where it belongs. And in order to understand where it belongs, we have to turn it into what it is. So processing takes those 2 steps. We process in a batch and we process till empty. And we do it, as I said, 5 plus or minus times per day. We'll spend 10, 12, 15 minutes out there processing and making sure that our information store is well tended to, well guarded. The third workflow is daily review. So once a day, at some point pretty early in the day, we engage in prepping our information for the rigors of the workday. Just put it that way. And you probably already have some sort of daily process in your life. I talk to many people, potential clients, who make a to-do list every day. Well, we're going to fix it so you don't have to do that anymore. There are some really kind of negative attributes to a to-do list that really cause it to not be a good way to try to track the stuff that we need to do. We talked about a backlog management system. So just briefly, if we think about a backlog management system, then it's a list of things that we're aware of to be done. And let's just take it from the task perspective. So it's a list of things that we're aware of need to be done at some point. We're aware that we're not doing them now. And we're keeping an eye on them on a relatively consistent basis. This as compared to waking up every morning and getting out a blank piece of paper and trying to write down everything that's on your mind in the morning. And then make sure that you get it all done before the next time you write a to-do list, which would be tomorrow. And so managing this backlog. So the thing that we do early in the morning is we use the backlog to present us a candidate list of things that perhaps would be useful to engage with in the coming time period, say today. And there's nuances about how we do this, and I'll teach you all that stuff as we get further into understanding how Attention Compass is built. But what we do is we pull from that backlog and we say, oh, yes, I'm aware of these things. This is not new. not only am I aware of them, but I've previously written them down, so I don't even have to query my brain about this. But okay, I've looked at them, I understand them, I've organized them, they've presented themselves to me when they need to be viewed again by me. And so I can just take the relatively easy step of pulling out of that and saying, okay, here's the things that I really think I should engage with in the next time period. Now, one of the big parts of the daily review is we then take that list and we validate it against our other commitments. And when I say other commitments, what I mean normally is we validate it against our calendar, because that's the other primary source of commitments, and where they're recorded is in our calendar. And so we get out our candidate list of things to do, and we get out our calendar and we see if these things are going to work together. We do it early in the morning so that we have the opportunity, if we need to change a commitment or renegotiate a commitment, we have an opportunity to do that pretty early, such that people can be generous with the kind of change that we're asking them to deal with on our behalf. So daily review takes about 12 or 15 minutes in the morning. It's part of becoming aware of the overnight information. There's some capture that's going on while all this happens, but at some point it becomes obvious that you do, in fact, have a candidate list of things that could be done today, and then you run them past your list of previous commitments and you make sure that everything works together. So that's the third workflow, is daily review. And the fourth workflow, finally, is weekly review. And weekly review is a 45-minute time period that happens about once a week. In fact, it's scheduled for exactly once a week, so we don't forget to do it. We don't push it around our calendar. There's a whole lesson on a script for weekly review, and there are certain ways that we walk through. It's basically, I say script, it's basically a checklist to help us think through the fact that, yes, we need to look at this, yes, we need to look at that. And what happens with weekly review is it's an opportunity to get away from the individual task level and look at bigger things like projects, at bigger things like goals, and to see how we're making progress against those bigger picture things. Maybe the most interesting feature of weekly review is that when we're finished with weekly review, and by we, I mean people who have implemented Attention Compass, that's the most clarity and control that we feel. And we feel it once a week. And it feels really good, because when weekly review is done and done well, we have this sense that we are actually in control of everything that we're aware of, and we're up to date on all of our commitments, and that all of the things that we've postponed are well postponed, and that all of the information that we're aware of that we need to be responsible for is stored somewhere where we can see it again. When we finish this weekly review process, that's when we're really at the very peak of our sense of calm control of our information and our tasks, and thus of our attention. So, quick review. There's a tool. We talked about the nature of the tool, and how the tool needs to be set up, and how the tool needs to be architected, what the tool needs to be able to do. But the tool by itself is useless without the 4 workflows that keep the tool working well for us. And we talked about those 4 workflows from most frequent to least. Capture is this semi-continuous thing that we're constantly recording information into the system. Processing is, this 5 plus or minus times a day, when we take the stuff that we've captured and we turn it into what it is, and we put it where it belongs. Daily review is this act of refreshing our backlog such that we're aware of things that need to have our attention. I'm saying today, and there's more to it. It's more nuanced than that, but you get the idea. Rather than having to sit down for 20 minutes every morning and pop quiz our brain for our to-do list, that's there already. We just need to select things from it that make sense for us to do today. And then we need to balance that selection against the other commitments that we've previously made. And finally, weekly review is the once a week big picture assessment of where we are. And it's a great thing. Attention Compass implementers look forward to weekly review because of that sense of calm control that's available afterwards. And at the end of the day, that's the goal. That's the goal of Attention Compass. That's why people want to implement Attention Compass, is because they recognize that they don't have this calm, peaceful productivity. And at some point, they understand, typically from me, often from other Attention Compass clients, that that sense of calm control is possible. And it's a nice feeling. And that we don't have to be frazzled and panicked all the time as we're doing our work and as we're managing our information, but that there's ways to be relaxed and to have our focus where it needs to be, when it needs to be there, such that we do our work and deliver it rather than continually worry and fret about it. And that's my goal for you. And that's why I do what I do, is because I want you to have this sense of calm, peaceful productivity in your own life. The best way I know to do that is for you to implement Attention Compass and for you to start managing your information and in particular your tasks in ways that make sense rather than managing them in ways that just increase your stress level. So that's why I'm recording this series, is to put this information into your hands so that hopefully you're able to move in the direction of having an Attention Compass for yourself. So I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.